So we'll be in Psalms 127. If you can, we're going to be doing a quick recap of what we've been talking about. This is an interesting psalm. We talked last time about how it's laid out. The last 2 weeks we've been studying it. This, as you see at the top, it says a psalm for Solomon, and some scholars believe it was written by Solomon but placed in the book of Psalms as because of Solomon. But Hezekiah is the one that put it in there. We talked about the idea that what Israel was facing at the time when they were facing the Assyrian army coming to capture Israel. They knew that Assyria was on the move, and that's the environment that they lived in. So there was a lot of fear within the city. And so we looked at in the first part, actually let me turn there. In the first two verses we looked at, except the Lord build the house, they that labor in vain that build it. Except the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh but in vain. It is vain for you to rise up early, to sit up late, to eat the bread of sorrows, for so he giveth his beloved sleep. Now that's as far as we got the last 2 weeks. But we looked at the idea that if we're going to build a house, a family, a church, whatever it is, if we're going to build it, if we don't do it without God as our guide, as our master builder, as our chief cornerstone, the thing that's going to lead us in that, it's in vain. It's pointless. It's basically what it means. That it's going to fall down. There's going to be failure. There's going to be cracks. And when those cracks happen, we won't know what to do with it. And so we need the Lord in our lives to be able to guide us and direct us. We looked at the idea that it's not just enough. We looked at building and Paul's directions around building. We looked about watching, and as a watchman, does the watchman fight the battle? Is he the one that keeps the city safe? He's going to fight the army that shows up. No, the watchman's role is to watch, right? The watchman's role is to be able to discern good and evil, to understand what the dangers are out there, understand when good is coming. Actually, Brother Corey and I were talking after last week's lesson about the USS Cole, when we know the bombing that happened on the USS Cole, and the weight that was put on the watchman that missed the watch, that didn't discern the difference between the boat that was out there that ended up bombing the USS Cole. The watchman has responsibilities. It's critical to know the difference between what's friendly and what's danger. And if we don't know that difference, it has serious consequences for us. Not just what's danger, but also we talk about what's good, right? We can keep good away from us because we put watches up, and we get so defensive that we don't even let good come sometimes. So as a watchman, we need to be able to see both good and evil. But what does he say there? It's vain for us if we watch without who? Without God, without our strength to be able to keep the city. We know that he's our strength, and we looked at that quite a bit. We looked at who our enemy is. We know that he's patient. He knows that he's probing, always looking to find ways in. We looked at the defenses and the idea of watching, and we looked at our powerful defender. Then at the end of last week, we looked at the idea of worrying, and the idea that he says there, it is vain for you to rise up early and to sit up late, to eat the bread of sorrows, for so he giveth his beloved sleep. The idea that we can worry without God, and what happens to us? It impacts us. We talked about it. It escalates as we continue to worry. It makes the problems worse. It doesn't make the problems better. That when worry comes in, we forget about turning to God first, and we try to take on stuff. What happens to our life? It can spiral, right? Our worry we get lack of sleep, and lack of sleep has a physical impact on us. So we start losing appetite. We may overeat, as he talks here, the bread of sorrows. Those things that are impacting us, if we don't turn to God and have God as the peace in the center of our life, what's going to happen to our lives? We can't even get sleep, as he says there. He says the blessing is, he says, for so he giveth his beloved sleep. Those that trust in him are able to get sleep. Losing my notes here. And so this week, and there's a break in this psalm that we talked. It's kind of an odd break, and I think it ties in as we get to the very end here. You'll see kind of how it all ties together. But we see that there's this vanity perspective in the first 2 verses. In the last 3 verses, there's a whole conversation around a certain value, the value of family, the value of children. And so when we look at this, we're going to look at this idea of the value of family. Look at verse 3. Let's read 3 through 5, and then we'll come back and study it some more. It says, "Lo, children are a heritage of the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is his reward. As arrows are in the hand of a mighty man, so are children of the youth. Happy is he that hath his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but they shall speak with the enemies in the gate." This is I would say, a very timely message in the world we live in today. We talk about children and the value of children, the importance of children to God, and how he feels about children. We talk about the first piece that he talks about here. He says, "Lo, children are heritage of the Lord." What's it mean to be a heritage of the Lord? When we think about that, we think about the idea that a heritage is a legacy. There's something that's carried on in a heritage. If I talk about, I have a Native American heritage, what does that mean? There's no politics involved in this, so just say it. What does it mean to have a Native American heritage? Okay, so I have some folks that my forefather, great-great-grandfather may have been Native American, but what's it mean really to say I have a heritage? So ancestry is one thing, but heritage is something different, right?
Some of the culture.
There's some culture, right?
Culture is some of the things that they thought should be moral principles.
Yeah, there's morals and principles and teachings that come with a heritage. We talked about before, my grandmother was born on the reservation in Washington. And so, I want to be able to say I have a Native American heritage. I have a Native American ancestry. My parents didn't raise me Native American. We didn't go to any powwows. We didn't have any go out in the woods hunting and, stalking buffalo or anything like that. We didn't have that kind of cultural heritage that they tried, the folks on the reservation still tried to preserve this day, the language or anything like that. I have an Irish American heritage, I guess, in some ways. But the idea here is, that heritage, there's something associated with that. There's something carried on from generation to generation. And as he says there, the children are what? A heritage of the Lord. We see that the children allow us to leave a legacy of faith. And we'll talk about provision in a minute, but a legacy of faith. What's that mean, a legacy of faith? What do you think that means, or what I mean by saying that? We have a legacy of faith that can be left by children. Yeah.
When you teach your children about Christ and give them principles to grow on, and then eventually lead them to salvation, and their faith grows, then you can pass it on to the next generation.
Absolutely. And Brother Bob preached on this for Father's Day. Actually, turn to Ephesians chapter 6. We're going to look at a few verses here. Turn to Ephesians chapter 6. Let's see if I can sit stuff down. Ephesians 6. And you should be able to quote this from last week. But this is one of the guidance given to fathers. And it says, "And you fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in what? The nurture and the admonition of the Lord." And the idea here is that there's, that's the purpose of fatherhood, right? There's a goal here in fatherhood. It's not just, I pay the bills. There's a larger, deeper meaning, purpose in fatherhood, and that's to bring children up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. Let's go back. We'll go, since you're in the New Testament, go to 3 John chapter 1, 3 John, verse 4. And this is John writing to the believers. He says, "I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth." And as a parent, to see your kid grow in faith, to see your kid to share his faith with others. It's funny when you think you know your kids, and then all of a sudden they tell you something. Oh, by the way, I was talking to my friend at church or at school, and telling about this and that, and it's like, oh, really? I remember Nolan came, and they were doing they're doing world history, and they're going through Egypt, talking about the Egyptian, gods and their religion and things like that. He got into a whole discussion with one of his teachers around religion and faith, and how that was a false god. And this it was like, wow, this is your son is. I didn't teach him that. I didn't say go out to your school and go teach your teachers about faith or anything like that. But when you hear that your children are walking in the love of the Lord, that's a legacy. That's something you can be proud of. That's a legacy that you can be proud of. Look at Proverbs chapter 20. Proverbs chapter 20 and verse 7, it says, the just man walketh in his integrity, his children are blessed after him. The idea here is that it's not that pattern of justice, of walking justly or walking rightly is set by who? The parents, right? Our kids will reflect who we are, good and bad, right? They pick up the bad just as much as they do the good. If you're in a household and you're bickering with your spouse, what's going to happen to your kids? What do you expect to see them do when they run into disagreements? They're going to mimic exactly how you handle a disagreement. We've talked before in other Sunday school class about someone had parents that would never argue in front of their kids. They would go hide in the closet, walk-in closet and argue, and the kids never knew they argued. And so when their kids got married, guess when they argued, what happened? They didn't know how to argue. And they wouldn't argue. They would avoid issues, and issues would fester for time and time again. And they finally talked to their parents, and they said, well, we never saw you argue. And they said, oh, we argue. We just didn't let you see it. And that pattern that was never taught to kids of like how to resolve conflict as an appropriate way. And so we read that. He says there, the just man walketh in his integrity. His children are blessed after them. Integrity is not something you see right away, right? You can't just tell a kid this is integrity. You got to see it. It's modeled. It's mimicked. That's all about this idea of legacy, the heritage of children. Children carry those things on that we do. Look at Psalms 112. Psalms 112, it says, praise ye the Lord. Blessed is the man that feareth the Lord, that delighteth greatly in his commandments. His seed shall be mighty upon the earth. The generation of the upright shall be blessed. Wealth and riches shall be in his house, and his righteousness endureth forever. Unto the upright there riseth light in the darkness. He is gracious and full of compassion and righteousness. A good man showeth favor and lendeth. He will guide his affairs with discretion. This is the idea, is that it says there, his seed shall be mighty upon the earth. The generation of the upright shall be blessed. The idea is if as a man, we had the men's camping trip, and so this was kind of on my mind as well, kind of carrying on an extra Sunday of Father's Day. But the idea is of leading a household of the blessing that children are. He says his seed is mighty upon the earth. The generation of the upright shall be blessed. Doesn't say just children will be blessed because anything, but they're blessed because they were taught, because they were led by the upright. So there's a legacy. Look at Psalms 145. We're not going to read the whole thing. You saw, he said 145, the whole chapter. But I encourage you to read it later on. This is not one of the ones we've been studying, but we'll read through the first 4 or 5 verses here. It says, I will extol thee, my King, my God, O King. I will bless thy name forever and ever. Every day will I bless thee. I will praise thy name forever and ever. Great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised, and his greatness is unsearchable. One generation shall praise thy works to another, and shall declare thy mighty works. And the idea here is that we as our generation, your generation, should be declaring that to our generation, and our generation should be declaring the great works of God to the next generation. And we should be carrying that on again and again. We talk about, it's easy for us as believers to kind of go through the routine and just get used to coming to church and seeing God do stuff. And we sometimes miss the miracle of Christ, a miracle of who God is, and the wonder in that sense. And this this is what he's reminding them. He says each generation should be proclaiming the great works of God, should be sharing, this is what God has done in my life, and that should be continued on and on. As Christian parents, it's easy for us just to say, yep, God did it, and just kind of go on and lose that wonder that should be there. It was exciting. I was actually, Brother Charlie here came in a couple Sundays ago, and he blessed my heart just hearing salvation and hearing his path to salvation. It lights my soul up to say, hey, that's what we need to be seeing. That's what I want to see. That's the miracle of birth, and so of rebirth, right? And so we see that should be encouraging us to share that with others. That's a legacy that we should be leaving from generation to generation. We know that that there's a generational importance, right? This isn't just, when it talks about children, they're not just there just to be seen and not heard, or just there to be kind of passive riders on a train as we carry them along to faith, right? We're expecting children to have a role in the ministry just as much as the adults are. Well, not as much, but they have a role in the ministry, that we shouldn't overlook them and the service that they provide. Look at Acts chapter 2. I've read this passage a few times. I studied it, looking at the early church and some of the characteristics of the early church. When I read this the other night, I noticed something in here. In verse 38, it says, then Peter said, and actually verse 37 says that when they heard this, they were pricked in their heart and said unto Peter and to the rest of the apostles, men and brethren, what shall we do? And Peter said unto them, repent and be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus Christ, for the remission of sins, and ye shall receive the gift of the Holy Ghost. For the promise is unto you and to your children and to all that are far off, even as many as the Lord our God shall call. And with many other words did he testify and exhort, saying, save yourselves from this untoward generation. Then they were gladly received his word, were baptized, and the same day were added unto them about 3,000 souls. And it's interesting, there's one little phrase that he put in there, that I've read over, that I've just passed over sometimes. And he says there in verse 39, he says, for the promise is unto you, and to what? To your children. The idea that salvation wasn't just for these men that had gathered and were questioning what should we do, and were pricked in their hearts. He wanted to see families saved. He wanted to see families come to know Christ. That promise of salvation was not just unto these parents, but unto their children as well, and to all that are far off, even as many as the Lord shall call. The idea here is that there's a generational importance. Turn to 1 Timothy. It's not enough just to have parents that come to salvation. We should need to be reaching children as well. 1 Timothy, if I can find it. And this is a familiar passage, I know, for most. He says, these things command and teach, let no man despise thy youth, but be thou an example of the believers in word and conversation, in charity, in spirit, in faith, and in purity. He's talking to a young man, a young pastor, and saying what? Don't let someone despise you because you're young. You need to be the example as a young person to all believers in word and conversation and charity and spirit and faith and in purity. Basically, in all areas, you need to be an example as a young believer. As young people, it's easy for us to say, well, I'm just young. I'll get to that later. When I'm older, I'll work on that faith stuff. Or I'll work on, trying to live a better life. I've got friends that are getting to that point now where some of them have kids, teenage kids, or they've got grandkids now. I know a friend that's got a grandkid now. It's just, no, I'm not ready for that. He's in the early 40s, but it's just it's making him to question his life and the changes that he needs to see in his life to get better. But as young people, we need to make that decision now. We need to be as older folks need to be encouraging young folks to be making those decisions in their life now and sharing with them the challenges that you faced and to encourage them, not to look down on young people for trying to serve the Lord or making mistakes as they move along. He says, let no man despise thou youth, but be thou an example of the believers. This is an encouragement to Timothy, because what did Paul know was going to happen as Timothy started to step out and lead as a young pastor? What was going to happen to him? What was going to happen to him with all the believers around him? What do you think he was facing? Was he going to get it all right? As a young pastor, was he going to step out and get it right? No. But he knew that as he stepped out, what was he going to face? Greater? He's going to face trials and tribulations. He's going to face criticism. You didn't have the best opening this morning when you started church. That joke you tried to make, that wasn't a good joke. Or whatever. That's what a young pastor is going to have to face. And he was warning him to say what? Don't let anyone despise thy youth, your energy. You ever had a young adult that's excited about the Lord, and you feel like he's running laps around you, and you're like, slow down now. I can't handle that. Don't despise his youth. Encourage that youth. Brother Bob mentioned yesterday of young people, a lady had 3 young boys, and she said he said they were high octane. He said that's just leadership that needs redirection. And so we need to think of our young people and encourage them, not to despise them for their youth. They're a heritage of the Lord. We need to remember that. There's a value to young people. There's a heritage of the Lord. Look at Proverbs. Last thing, verse 17. Proverbs 17. Verse 6. It said, children are the crown of old men, and the glory of children are their fathers. And when we read this, I've heard it preached before, and I've read it before. It's easy just to read that kind of how it's laid. It says, children are the crown of old men, and the glory of children are their fathers. It doesn't mean that children have a glory in their fathers. It means that children are the glory of their fathers. It's the idea that as a father, when you see your child grow up, when you see that's as a father, that's something you can be proud of. You can be that proud father of your children. And it talks about grandchildren here as well. Children are the crown of old men. That you can, I'm not there yet. I'm not ready to have grandkids for another at least 15, 20 years, maybe. We'll see. But as grandkids, as a grandparent, you treat your grandkids differently, right, than you did your kid. There's a different love and grace and care for them. You're probably a little more forgiving than you were because you can give them back, and then their kids have to deal with all the things that you left them with, the sweets and the other stuff. But the idea is that they're a crown of old men. They're an encouragement. They're the glory that you receive. And so as children, we have to realize that they're a heritage of the Lord. There's value there as young people. The other piece we think about is the heritage of the Lord. It's not just about our own children. And this verse kind of stuck with me because I've got several friends also who have dealt with challenges of not being able to have children. And so we're talking about the heritage of children here. Children are a heritage of the Lord. That they're not, that doesn't say anything about my own children. It just says children, right? Children are a heritage of the Lord. Look at Psalms chapter 113. I thought this was an interesting verse. We think about it's not just my own children, but how I treat other children as well. In verse 9 it says, He maketh the barren woman to keep house, and to be a joyful mother of children. Praise ye the Lord. And what that word means, to keep house, means to prepare a place, prepare a house. And it's the idea that as someone who can't have children, she was still able to care for children, still able to share that love with children, even though she couldn't have children of her own. And that's a blessing. That's an encouragement. There's children in this world that need a home, need a safe and stable home. We heard a prayer request earlier about children in foster care. They need a safe and stable home. They need godly parents, godly leadership, and godly homes to be able to go into. And so the opportunity to care for someone. I've got friends that they couldn't have a child for quite a while, adopted, and had for several years, and then had their own child. It was God had prepared and led them down that path, and now they're starting a ministry to help folks that can't have children and they're looking to adopt. But we have to understand that children are important. They're valuable. Every life is valuable. We'll talk about that in a minute, a little bit more. Psalm 68. I'm going to go through a couple verses because I think it's important for us to not just look at our own children and kind of be selfish on the heritage of our own children, the legacy that we leave with our own children, but of the children around us. We have several children, and we've talked about it with our bus ministries and parents that send their kids on the bus, and we encourage the parents and want to see the families come, but some parents will send their kids to church. Vacation Bible schools happening all around the country. They'll send their kids to Vacation Bible School, and they'll never step foot in a church ever, because they want to have a few hours without their kids, and not because they want to work on their relationship with their spouse, but just because they want to get rid of their kids for a few hours. And we as churches need to be aware of that we need to be loving these kids and show, because that may be the only love that some of these kids see throughout the day, throughout the week. So look at Psalm 68 and verse 4. It says, "Sing unto the Lord, sing praises to his name, extol him that rideth upon the heavens by his name Jah, and rejoice before him. A father of the fatherless and a judge of the widows is God in his holy habitation. God setteth the solitary in families, he bringeth out those which are bound with chains, but the rebellious dwell in a dry land." The idea as believers, we should be showing that love of who God is. He says, a judge of the widows is God in this holy habitation. The idea that he's the justice, he's the protector is what that means there, of the widows. That he's a father of the fatherless. We have to show that love of Christ, of who God is, the physical manifestation. We are his representation on earth, and we need to show that to those the fatherless. We need to show that. He says that God setteth the solitary in families. The idea is that he's preparing a home for a family that doesn't have a home, is what that means. The idea that we need to be caring. But it's interesting, in verse 4 he talks about singing praises, and then he talks about families that are struggling, families that are broken, families that are facing challenges. In verse 4 he says, "Sing unto God, sing praises to his name, extol him, and rideth upon the heavens by his name Jah, and rejoice before him." See, our approach to serving those around us, those that don't have stable homes or may have broken homes, shouldn't be one of pity. You see what he says there? What's he say there? He says, "Extol him that rideth upon the heavens by his name Jah, and rejoice before him." See, when we approach these families, there's a blessing that we should be sharing of ourselves. See, God has given us great, amazing things. We have a Father who owns a cattle on 1,000 hills. And he says there, don't go and share, to be the father of the fatherless for those out of pity, but do it out of rejoicing. Do it out of praise. So let's move on. But it's the idea that we should be caring for those that can't care for their families. We should help be building families up. Look at, let's go back to verse 3 in 127. He says, "And the fruit of the womb is his reward." Again, this is one of those challenging conversations today. We talk about the fruit of the womb being the reward of God, being a reward of the Lord. When we talk about the debate around abortion and pro-life and pro-choice, as believers, we think it's an easy conversation to have, but it's not. There are people involved in all of these, and it's a tough conversation. It's a tough issue to address. It's a clear approach that we need to have as far as life. Well, we need to choose life in every situation, but to have that conversation is a tough one. But we see in Psalms, we've looked at this, so turn a couple pages over to Psalms 139. There's without doubt that God knows every child that's being formed. He says there in verse 13, "For thou hast possessed my reins, thou hast covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. My substance was not hid from thee, when I was made in secret and curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Thine eyes did see my substance, yet being unperfect, and in thy book all my members were written, which is in continuance were fashioned, when as yet there was none of them." And clearly in this psalm, we know that as David wrote, he understood that that God was the one that made that child. God was the one that ordained that child to be, and ordained it in the sense that he even knew every part before it was even formed and created. When it talks about the reward of the womb, there's an intimate design to that reward. Right? God knows that every bit, every being, part of that substance, as he says, the substance of their being, he knows. That there's something precious about that. When we think of children, and we think of reward, we often think of something they've earned. That's often a common joke. We talk about sports today. Everybody gets a trophy, right? Here's your participation trophy. You earned it. Well, no, you really didn't. You just participated. And so we hear reward, we think that's what it's talking about here, and it's not. He's talking about the value of that child. What is the value of that child to you? What is the value of children? What does our society say today about the value of children? When are children valued in our current political society? They're priceless, yeah, and that's what we see here. He's the reward of the womb. But in our current political society, what does it say? When they're born, right? If they survive, that's when they're valued. But God says that's they're precious before that, right? They're a reward of the womb. We see that they're created in the womb, and then He knows our parts even from them. Look at Matthew. We see also that children have a precious worth. Look at Matthew chapter 18. I know you've heard this passage preached before, but Matthew 18. It says, and time came when the disciples unto Jesus, saying, Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus called a little child unto him, and set him in the midst of them. And he said, Verily I say unto you, except ye be converted and become as this little child, ye shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. Whosoever therefore shall humble himself as a child, the same is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Who shall receive one such little child in my name receiveth me. But whoso shall offend one of these little ones which believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone were hung around his neck, and that he were drowned in the depths of the sea. I mean, this is Christ speaking about children and the value of children. What's he say there in verse 5? Whoso shall receive one little child receiveth me. You know, we say, well, Christ, you haven't knocked on my door today. You didn't ask to come in and eat dinner at my house. Well, what's he say there? Whoso receiveth one little child receiveth me. When that kid has a need, has a care that you don't know, the neighborhood kid, that needs something, or that kid that needs, that's wandering around and your parents don't take care of them. You receive them into your home. You receive them into your life, and spend time with them and care for them. What's he say there? Who are you receiving? You're receiving Christ. He says, treat them like you would treat me. Love them like you would love me. The idea that the reward of the womb, the blessing that we should be given, the value that we should place on children, on life, is like who? As if we were receiving Christ into our homes, into our lives. Look at John chapter 16. John chapter 16 and verse 21. And actually, we'll look in verse 20. It says, Verily, verily, I say unto you, that ye shall weep and lament, but the world shall rejoice, and ye shall be sorrowful, but your sorrow shall be turned into joy. And he's talking to his disciples about how he'll return, and it'll look as a dark day, and there'll be sorrow in the earth among the believers, because they'll feel like all hope is lost. In verse 21, he says, a woman, when she is in travail, has sorrow because her hour is come, but as soon as she is delivered of the child, she is remembered no more the anguish for joy that a man is born into the world. And the idea is, a child, there's an innate value when a child is born, to be able to see that child and to see that precious, all the fingers and toes, and to see that face of a child. There's a joy that comes from that. And that's, God put that in us, right? God makes that's important. And evolutionists will say, well, that's part of the evolutionary process because a child can't take care of itself, and that's just a reaction that is deep down in you, so you'll take care of that child, right? But what's he say there? He says that there's a joy that comes. That's not evolutionary. That's given by God. That's a joy that comes because of the preciousness that He's given that He's placed upon children. Look at Psalms chapter 8. Chapter 8 and verse 2, it says, out of the mouth of babes and sucklings thou hast ordained strength because of thine enemies, that thou mightest still the enemy and the avenger. This is an interesting phrase. This is, out of the babes and sucklings hast thou ordained strength because of thine enemies. Actually, in verse 1, it says, our Lord, how excellent is thy name in all the heaven, who has set thy glory above the heavens. He's comparing here, kind of making the contrast here between God, who's the God of all the heavens, and he brings it down to and says, out of children, basically, out of little kids, can you speak more truth and strength than an army? Because thou hast ordained because of thine enemies, that thou mightest still the enemy and the avenger. Children say it how it is. They speak truth. God has given them the ability. I mean, they also lie, but they do speak truth. When you ask them what their household is like, they'll tell you. They'll tell you even if you don't ask. Here's what my parents did today. Or here's how they did. They'll go on and tell you whole stories about their household. But the idea here is that you ask a child who God is, they'll tell you. Right? They don't sit in hem and haw and think about, well, who's God, and well, God really is like this, and sometimes he's like this. They tell you who God is. There's no doubt about that. There's a preciousness to listening to children when it comes to who God is. God has placed value upon children, not just because of what their potential, but who they are individually. Look at Mark chapter 9. Sorry, actually, go to Isaiah. Go to Isaiah chapter 8. I'll make you stop in between. We won't flip back and forth. Isaiah chapter 8 and verse 18. It says, behold, I and the children whom the Lord hath given me are for signs and for wonders in Israel from the Lord of the hosts, which dwelleth in Mount Zion. He's talking here prophetically about Christ himself. That the Christ would come as a child, and that he would provide signs and wonders. But he says, I and the children whom the Lord hath given me are for the signs and for the wonders in Israel from the Lord of hosts. And some commentators have talked about this, that this applies both to the prophetic aspect of who Christ is coming, but also just talks to what he says there. I and the children with the Lord have given me are signs and wonders in Israel from the Lord of hosts. He says their children are a reward of the womb. They're a sign and wonder of who God is. Think about that. When you think of what it takes to create a child, this child grows from nothing, pretty much, and grows into a full-blown person. When they're born, they're a person. They have personality. Even before they're born, they have personality and character. They react to things. And the idea that God is, that there's a miracle there when it comes to think of what a child is. Look at Mark chapter 9. In verse 35, we'll look at verse 33. It says, and he came to Capernaum, and being in the house, he asked, what is it that ye disputed among yourselves on the way? And they held their peace by the way. They disputed among themselves who should be the greatest. And he sat down and called the 12 and said unto them, if any man desire to be first, the same shall be last of all and servant of all. And he took a child, and he set him in the midst of them. And we had taken them in his arms. He said unto them, whosoever shall receive one such children in my name receiveth me. And whosoever receiveth me whosoever shall receive me receiveth not me, but him that sent me. And the idea again is it's another instance where Christ is reaffirming the idea that bringing in children into the faith is what? It's important. It's important as receiving Christ. It's bringing them up in the faith. That's not just important of receiving Christ, but receiving God. God has blessed children, and as believers, and this is I know that hopefully, just like last week, I hopefully got it, that we have to trust in the Lord. This one's talking about we have to work with children. We have to care about children and value them highly, not just value them because they're our own. We need to value them because of of what God has given them and the preciousness that God has placed in them. Let's look at now we know kind of where they come from. Whoops, sorry, I didn't click. Let's talk about this second. This verse 4. It says, "Arrows of a mighty man." Verse 4 of 127 says, as arrows of a mighty man, so are children of the youth. I'm not an archer. I played around with a bow when I was a kid, just in the backyard kind of thing. I've never been archery hunting or anything like that. But I get the basics, the mechanics of hunting with a bow. What do you got to do? First thing, you got to have the right equipment, right? You got to have a bow. You got to have the right arrows. And we think of the idea of the arrow itself. He says they are arrows of a mighty man. Where do arrows come from, especially in David's day? They weren't carbon fiber, whatever, but where did they come from in David's day? They're wood, right? They would find a straight stick, and they would shave it down and get it just the right shape. They would put the feather on it to help balance it. They would put whatever on the front, some stone or rock or metal on the front to give it the tip. But the idea that as children, as arrows, do children come ready to go, ready to be shot out? How do children come? I wish I had a manual. It's like we hear that often as new parents. I wish I had a manual to be able to know how to raise and prepare them. And that's the idea. The idea is as children are arrows, they have to be shaped. Look at Proverbs chapter 22. We've already seen Ephesians 6:4, that we should be raising them up in the nurture and admonition. Look at Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 6. He says, train up a child in the way he should go. When he was old, he will not depart from it. Deuteronomy chapter 31, if you want to flip there, I can skip back that way. I know you've heard this passage as well. It says, gather the people together, men and women and children, and thy stranger that is within thy gates, that they may hear and that they may learn and fear the Lord your God, and observe to do all the words of his law, and that your children, which have not known anything, may hear and learn to fear the Lord your God as long as you live in the land, whither ye go over Jordan to possess it. Again, as children don't have the understanding to know, like, this is the way I should go. And it's a responsibility as parents, as grandparents, as church members, as believers, to encourage children and shape children to be able to be shot off in the direction that they need to go, to be successful in the purpose that they were created. As Ryan, my neighbor, and I went on the camping trip with us this past couple days, and we got a chance to ride back and talk a bit. And we were talking about this idea of, as parents, we have a responsibility to shape our children and to prepare them. When we look back at Psalms chapter 127, what are some things that as parents we have to do with the Lord? What's the first thing he says? We have to build a house with the Lord, right? We've got to have the guidance of the Lord in building a house. We have to watch and set up a perimeter. We have to be able to see the dangers around us as parents, right? We also have to be able to commit and put our faith in the Lord for the things that we can't control and not worry about them. And he's talking about parenting, as he's talking about all three of those at the beginning of Psalms 127. And as we're shaping our children, preparing our children to go out into the world, we've got to be careful that we don't do it of our own effort, our own energy, our own effort, right? As we send children out in the world, we can try to build it on our own. We can try to figure this out on our own. But if we don't turn to God, what's going to happen to our children as we send them out? They're going to go astray, right? They're not going to go in the direction that we hope that they're going to go. If we do it on our own and say, well, I think this is the way I should discipline, or I think this is the thing that I should teach them about, and I don't give them any principles or any basis or any founding in God's Word, it's just going to be my opinion. And as parents, it's easy for us to give our opinions on things, right? It's easy. As people, we're easy to give opinions on things. But we've got to be careful that our opinions are based upon what God has said. So as we guide our children grow up and they learn, right? They get smart. They learn how to read. They can figure out when parents are telling them, here's what I want you to do, versus what God really wants us to do, or why God really wants us to do it. And so we've got to be careful that we don't, that we build upon the right thing, that we don't set the wrong watch, or we set a watch that keeps away the good and the bad. That we've got to make sure that we don't rely on our own selves to try and solve things, but we actually trust in God. Look at Proverbs chapter 29. We think about that bow and the arrows that sits on there. What do I have to do to be able to shoot that arrow? You've heard this analogy before, I'm sure. What do you have to do to shoot the arrow? You have to draw it back. You don't believe me, but we're going to finish in 5 minutes. Proverbs chapter 29. Sorry, I skipped too far. In verse 15, he says, the rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself bringeth his mother to shame. When the wicked are multiplied, transgressions increase, but the righteous shall see their fall. Correct thy son, and he shall give thee rest. Yea, he shall give delight unto thy soul. The idea that sometimes we've got to draw that bow back, right? That doesn't look like progress to a kid. Kids don't understand rules. They don't understand discipline. It's tough to understand that when you're going through it, right? God does that for us. We won't go there today, but God does that for us, right? We looked at that in Hebrews. I think Pastor talked about it last week. What's he say? What does God do to the ones he loves? He chastens us, right? He draws us back. He pulls us in close. When I have that arrow, what am I doing to that arrow as I pull it back? I'm pulling it in close to me, right? Me and that arrow, I'm looking right down that line where that arrow is, where I want it to go, but I've got to have that arrow really close. If I hold it out here and I try to draw it back, what's going to happen? It's not going to go very, very effectively, right? I've got to draw it in close. And so as a parent, as a believer, we want to see children, we got to grow them, we got to draw them in close to be able to correct them and guide them and lead them. And we want to set them on a course. Look at Proverbs chapter 3. This is probably a good one out of those verses. This is the guidance of Solomon to his children. Proverbs chapter 3. He says, my son, forget not my law, but let thine heart keep my commandments. For the length of days and long life and peace shall they add to thee. Let not mercy and truth forsake thee. Bind them about thy neck, write them upon the table of thy heart. So shalt thou find favor and good understanding in the sight of God and man. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. As a parent, we want to set our kid on the right path, and we want to send them in the direction that they need to go. But if we're not guided by the Lord, where's that direction going to be? It's going to be off, right? And so, as a parent, we want to set them on the right course as arrows of a mighty man. It's not just the strength of the mighty man, right? What makes the mighty man mighty with his arrows? He knows how to shoot it, right? In the way it's supposed to go. I can be the best, I can be the strongest guy in the world, and King David puts me on the archery line, and I can't shoot a straight arrow, but I can shoot it really far. How helpful is that? It's not at all. So as parents, I've got to have the right direction. I've got to have the right course that I need to be sending my children on. And so then the goal is that they hit the mark, right? Then sometimes we see the arrow hit the mark. Sometimes as parents, we'll never see the arrow hit the mark. And so we've got to be prepared to send them on a journey that we may not see the end of, or hopefully we don't see the end of their journey, but we need to send them on a path that we're not going to always see the rewards from. But he says, as the arrows of a mighty man, so are the children of thy youth. Look at the last thing I think of as well. When we think about the archer, what is the archer really trying to do? Hit the target, right? There's provision there. If I was thinking of our hunting trip, talking to Brother Mike, I'm thinking of they go bow hunting and actually bring food back, right? There's provision involved. They're actually providing with that arrow. As a parent, we joke, I've got a sister that's younger, y'all know, and we joke back and forth of who's going to take care of mom when we're older. And, she's going to live with Emily in New York, just because it's on video. I'm saying it now. She's going to live with Emily in New York. But we joke about that, but there's some reality to that as parents. Generations today are what we call sandwich generation, where they're taking care of kids and they're taking care of parents at the same time. And we hope that you've taken care of your kids good enough that they take good care of you, that you've shown the love and the care. So down the road, there's provision that you hope that happens, but you also hope that there's impact down the road, that legacy has really left a legacy for children, for your children in the future, that they are passing on those good values, that good heritage to the next generation. So lastly, let's look at this end of this verse. This is the last fun part of this. Psalm 127 verse 5, it says, happy is the man that hath his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but they shall speak with the enemy in the gate. And the idea of speak there is the idea that they will be able to speak authoritatively or be able to subdue the enemy in the gate. Not doesn't mean that they'll just hang out with bad people. That's not what he's talking about there. It's the idea that they will be able to speak with the enemy in the gate or subdue them at the gate. And the gate is an interesting thing, and I'm sorry, I'll make it 6 minutes. The gate is an interesting thing because gate is where things would come into the city. And so as a parent, we want to see our kids grow up so that they can be self-sustaining, that they can be, we can trust that they're going to make good decisions in the world, that we don't have to, that we can be proud of them to be able to go and stand in the gate and make judgments that are good, that are sound, that are going to uplift not just us, but the city around them, right? This is what he's talking about. The idea that he says, happy is the man. He's not just happy because he has a lot of kids. He says that they shall not be ashamed, but they shall speak with the enemies in the gate. I want my kids to grow up to be able to be a testimony for God. That's what I want to see. I want to see that that I have to have a selfless perspective about my children. It's not about me. It's not about my future. It's about them and what their future is going to be. It's setting the right expectations. It's seeing that through their faith that seeing the strength that God has through their faith. So as we kind of think of this passage, we talked about it a little bit earlier, the idea without God's guidance and strength in our lives, it's pointless for us to lead our families or our churches, to build and grow or to guard against the dangers of the world around us. Without God as our guide in that, we must be intentional about raising our children in a way that sends them into the world prepared to face any challenge with God as their strength and guide. Like, that's the heart of what this psalm is getting at. I believe this is a psalm of Solomon because I think of the vanity aspect of what Solomon faced, and he wanted to send his children out into the world to do great things for God. And so as a church, I think we need to be sure that we have the right perspective of children around us, not just our own, but the children that step into this door, the children that never step into the door of a church. We need to have that compassion and that care for the children in this community, so that we can show that we understand that they're a heritage of the Lord, that they're a reward of the womb, that they're precious and special in God's eyes, and they need the salvation just as much as anybody else does. And so I pray that as a church, we continue to go out and serve and reach children for the Lord. It's good timing, VBS coming up, and it's exciting to see folks volunteer and see a lot of folks sign up for VBS. Don't be afraid to serve in our kids' ministries. We do patch clubs and stuff. We need folks that can just fix snacks for kids and show that you love them through the skills that you have. It doesn't mean that you have to stand up and teach kids to be working in children's ministries, but we need to see our church family serving and caring for our kids. I can't raise my kids on my own. I need you all to help do that. I need the Lord to help do that, and so I continue to pray for our families, continue to pray for our church, and we'll stop there. Any last minute questions? Yes, sister.
In your outline under values, you had A, heritage of children, and then there was C, arrows of mighty man. What was B?
Reward of the womb.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
All right, so we'll be moving on to another psalm next week. I don't know, I haven't talked to my dad. 73, Psalm 73. So if you want to read ahead on that, we'll go from there. All right, let's close in a word.